"This old black man's head looks like the perfect spot to test my new spray paint," the white cop laughed, then sprayed directly onto the head of an elderly veteran who stood silently on the sidewalk. The old man didn't resist. He had seen worse on the battlefield. But just 7 seconds later, when a man in plain clothes approached, scanned the scene, and sent a single message from his phone, everything began to collapse. No one knew who he was. Not until the entire country was brought to its knees. Which state do you live in, and how far are your police allowed to go in humiliating citizens? The wooden chair placed outside Ramsey's barber was like a fixture of the old street, weathered, leaning slightly to the left, yet no one had ever dared to move it. The man who sat on it was just the same. Ellis Winston, a black man whose gaze no one could hold for more than 3 seconds, because in those eyes lived too much. Wounds, experience, loss, and something the younger generation called an unshakable presence. In this town, everyone knew he was a former combat medic who had served in Quang Tri, the man who saved 6 soldiers in one night with nothing but 2 rolls of gauze, a dagger, and a trembling hand. But that was long ago. Now, people only saw him sitting there every Friday afternoon, with a cap that read Combat Medic, mid-1971, one hand resting on a wooden cane carved with his unit's name, the other always carefully gripping a plastic bag containing his pillbox. The sidewalk where he sat had been repaved 3 times. The barber shop had changed owners twice, but the chair remained the same. It was the only thing that didn't bow to time, and perhaps that's why it irritated Brad Kinley, the newly assigned patrol officer, so much. He didn't like anything that stayed in place without permission, even less so things that existed without explanation. Brad stepped out of his patrol car, still holding a can of soda. His confident stride wasn't the kind that came from having seen death, but rather the kind born from never having been denied. High and tight haircut, cheap sunglasses, a crooked badge on his chest. He approached Ellis like he was inspecting a vagrant sleeping in the wrong spot, then scoffed. "Didn't think these old fossils still existed," he said, tilting his head back like he was talking to the air. Ellis didn't respond. His eyes didn't even meet Brad's face. He only followed a leaf falling slowly from the maple tree above. It was the only kind thing left on that day. "This chair yours?" Brad continued. "Or do you think this whole sidewalk is some living monument to the guys who crawled out of Asian jungles?" A passerby slowed down, reaching for their phone. Brad glanced over, smirked, then growled. "Go ahead, record it, buddy. Just make sure you frame it right. Don't want any kids thinking these old men are heroes." That's when Ellis looked up. His deep black eyes held no expression, but they weren't empty either. They were like a void, reflecting light, forcing the one staring into them to confront themselves. "You think you're some kind of monument?" Brad sneered, pulling a small red spray paint can from his pocket. "Then let me decorate you properly." No one had time to stop him. No one believed it was real. Just the dry hiss of paint sprayed across hair, cap, scalp, the kind of sound no one forgets if they've ever tagged an old brick wall. A stench of chemicals cut through the air, mixing with the afternoon sun and engine oil fumes from the nearby repair shop, creating a scent that triggered a primal reaction. Humiliation. Ellis didn't move. Only the cane in his hand slipped to the ground, the wooden crack as dry as snapping a bone. The shaft split in 2, the inscription Delta Medical Team now face down, as if buried without fanfare. Brad stepped back, admiring his art like some twisted painter. "You ever save anyone, old man?" he shouted, lifting the can again. "Well, now it's our turn to save society from ghosts like you." Just then, a young woman burst out from the barber shop, shouting, "He just got discharged this morning. He still has the hospital band on his wrist, you psycho!" A small crowd began to gather. Their eyes didn't shine with sympathy, but with something far more familiar, the same thrill one gets when witnessing a car crash. Brad turned, ready to intimidate the girl, but the crowd wasn't looking at her. They were looking at the old man. His hair streaked red, his white shirt stained down the collar. A wrinkled blood pressure cuff still loosely coiled around his left wrist. A teenager raised his phone to live stream. Brad cursed and lunged to snatch it, but it was too late. 6 others had already filmed it. A woman screamed, "Don't touch him again." A middle-aged man shouted, "That's Mr. Winston, don't you know?" But Brad heard none of it. All he could grasp was this: he was the only one in uniform here, and that goddamn chair was teaching him a lesson about power, without saying a single word. The sidewalk was streaked with red like blood, not from a wound, but from a truth that had just been torn open. People remained frozen in place. No one knew what to do. No one dared step forward. Because what had just happened wasn't a simple abuse of authority. It was a stab into the nation's memory, where men like Ellis once stood between death and life for boys who now wore badges and believed they were the law. A few minutes later, Brad walked back to his car. His face was flushed not with rage, but with something he had never felt before, the realization that the crowd no longer feared him. His phone rang. He didn't pick up. One sentence repeated in his head, not something anyone said aloud, but something uttered by Ellis's silence. When a man doesn't fight back, it's not because he's weak. It's because he's decided not to hurt anything anymore. And for Brad, that was the first time in his life he feared a man who didn't even have to chamber around. It happened in the span of a breath. Not a dramatic, gasping kind, but the kind that slips out when something irreversible unfolds in front of your eyes and you forget you're alive until it ends. One breath, 23 seconds, one camera held by one trembling hand. That was all it took. The clip started mid-mobile. Not with the officer's arrival, not with the insult, but right at the instant Brad Kinley raised the spray can to eye level and snarled, "Lift your head, I want to paint it clear." The frame shook as the person filming flinched, but the image didn't lie. Brad's boot stomped down on the split cane, still visible with its carved lettering, splintering it completely with a sickening crunch. The sound wasn't edited. It wasn't enhanced. It was the real sound of authority grinding dignity into the pavement. And then came the hiss. A pressurized cloud of red paint blasted directly into the center of Mr. Ellis Winston's forehead, soaking down with casual cruelty. It didn't stop at the skin. It bled into the fibers of the navy blue cap, right into the words stenciled across the front in faded white, "Combat Medic, Vietnam, 1971. The symbolism was almost too perfect, so brutal it felt staged, yet too raw to be anything but true. Brad's voice followed, dripping with sarcasm as he turned to the crowd. Unaware the phone in the corner of the frame was still rolling. "You people think honor's some little medal you stuff in your sock drawer? I see it as a damn excuse for an old man to act like he owns the sidewalk." Laughter followed. From Brad. No one else, not a single bystander so much as exhaled. The clip cut out before the woman screamed, before the gasps, before the chaos, but it didn't need more. The world had already seen enough. It was posted online 2 hours later by a teenage barista who had walked past at the wrong, or perhaps the right, moment. The title was simple: "Cop Paints a Vet." Literally. Within 15 minutes, the video had over 70,000 views. Before midnight, it had been pulled from every major platform. The reasons given ranged from graphic content to violation of local community standards. But by then, it was too late. There were 6 archived mirrors, including one uploaded to a decentralized veteran forum with the caption, "We don't need hashtags. We just need eyes." At exactly 12:04 a.m. a second post appeared on a student-run medical blog. It came from a third-year nursing student named Clarissa Mendez. The post contained only the clip and a single line beneath it. "I don't know who he is, but those eyes. No one deserves to be treated like that." Her blog wasn't famous. She had fewer than 300 followers. But within 4 hours, it was picked up by 4 independent news outlets and syndicated across 22 alternative press networks. Something in that sentence landed deeper than outrage. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. Everyone had seen a moment like that before. Everyone had watched someone be humiliated, erased, brutalized, and everyone had chosen silence. This time, someone had hit record. The video became known unofficially as the 23rd second. That was the frame when the can hissed and the paint struck. That single instant froze history, his and theirs. and branded it across the conscience of a nation. No soundtrack, no narration, just a man whose head had once bowed in prayer while stitching the last breath back into a soldier's chest, now being sprayed like a graffiti wall by someone too young to understand what war looked like. And the paint didn't just touch his skin, it crawled downward in messy rivulets, soaking the collar of his crisp white shirt, sliding past the folded edge of his sleeve and pooling just above the line of his heart. There, the red bloomed like a flower in reverse, born of disrespect, petaled in ignorance, rooted in a soil of systemic arrogance. The onlookers, those who had stood motionless in the background of the video, were now watching themselves in shameful reflection. They weren't just witnesses, they were characters. Every pair of eyes in that clip was a mirror, and what they saw wasn't just Brad Kinley's cruelty, it was their paralysis. In that 23-hour frame, Mr. Winston never blinked. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, unmoved, unwavering. It was the kind of stare that made young men fail lie detectors, a look forged in fire, in blood and sand and jungle. It was the gaze of someone who had seen things you wouldn't dare name. A man who once held back death with a tourniquet and grit now holds back indignation with stillness. Brad, of course, had no idea. To him, it was another Thursday, another community engagement turned sour. He was too busy bragging to fellow officers that he'd put a relic back in his box to notice the world folding in around him. His words were clipped, cruel. You saw how he looked at me? Like he was above it all? I gave him a reason to look down. When someone in the precinct asked whether he thought the guy might have been a vet, Brad scoffed. Everyone's a vet these days. Doesn't mean you get to camp outside a barber shop like it's Arlington. But that line, that arrogant, flippant line, would come back to haunt him. It would be quoted in articles, printed on posters, and even spray-painted on precinct walls in the weeks that followed. Not in support, in fury, in disbelief, because for the first time in a long time, the country didn't rally behind the badge. It rallied behind a quiet man with red-stained shoulders who hadn't said a word. The image of Ellis Winston sitting perfectly still, his shirt ruined, his cane shattered at his feet, and his cap violated by red paint, became a symbol not just of disrespect, but of America's selective amnesia, the kind that forgets who bled for the freedoms it flaunts, the kind that bows to flags, but not to the people who carried them home. The most powerful reaction wasn't viral outrage. It was silence, not apathy, something heavier. No one knew what to say, because what could be said? What words fix the act of defacing a veteran's identity? What sentence undoes the weight of a boot on a legacy? So instead of answers, the world gave attention. Reluctantly, shamefully, the police department issued no statement. Not yet. Internal Affairs had been informed. Brad was on administrative leave, but none of that mattered. Because in every house, on every street where the video played, one sentence repeated itself like a heartbeat. That could have been my grandfather. And then came the harder thought. Would I have stood still too? Somewhere in a quiet room, Ellis Winston was wiping the paint off his cap, knowing it wouldn't come out, not fully. Some stains stay, not because they're permanent, but because they shouldn't be removed. And somewhere else, far away, a young woman named Clarissa clicked post one more time. She didn't know the man's name, but she had already seen more of him in that stare than she'd seen in a year's worth of lectures on integrity. The 23rd second wasn't just a moment, it was a fracture, and like all fractures, it would either heal wrong or finally force the bone to reset. By the time the clip had been online for 4 hours, it was no longer just footage. It was a reckoning. It started the way all things viral do, not with a bang, but with an intake of collective breath. One shaky phone screen, one 30-second glimpse of injustice framed in a blur of asphalt, steel tube boots, and the gleam of a silver walking cane snapped in two. No music. No filters, no content, just raw humiliation, delivered at the hands of a uniform. The caption on the original upload was simple, almost sterile. Ellis, downtown, Gate 3, someone needs to explain this. But the internet needed no explanation. The first hour, 17,000 shares. The second, just over 90,000 comments, each one angrier than the last. By the third hour, it had reached trending status on every major platform, and by the fourth, it had exploded beyond containment. One pinned comment beneath the clip stood alone, sitting like a bullet casing on the tiled floor of cyberspace. It read, "I'm a Marine. 2 tours in Fallujah. That man pulled me out of a burning Humvee. You think this is just a video? This is how they treat the people who saved us." Over 10,000 likes in 40 minutes. No one argued with it. No one dared. Because in the 30-second clip, the world witnessed a white cop named Brad Murphy jam the muzzle of a chemical spray bottle into the forehead of an old black man holding nothing but a cane and a quiet stare. The footage shook. The lens tried to adjust. The camera operator whispered, "Oh my God." But the most arresting image wasn't the violence, it was the stillness. The screen trembled, the crowd shifted, but the eyes of the man, eyes that had seen more than this country ever dared record, did not. They stayed, locked, centered, unflinching, like the camera was afraid to meet him but couldn't look away either. Someone replayed it in slow motion and paused it at the 23rd second, froze the frame, zoomed in, brightened it, isolated the moment like it was evidence in a trial, and there it was, the shattered cane. The steel tip hits the pavement, the way Brad laughed, a short, satisfied bark, and the hiss of pepper spray caught mid-air like a comet arcing from a bad man's fist. All of it punctuated by the sound of people doing nothing, but not anymore. By the end of that same night, newsrooms were split in two, some still mouthing the old hymns of order, compliance, protocol, while others began asking the question they were trained to avoid: who the hell is Ellis? The answer came not from an anchor nor a press release. It came from a whisper. Beneath one reposted version of the clip on a veterans forum, buried among thousands of reposts and rewatches, one comment lit up like a flare gun over silent waters. "I think I've seen that man before. Not here. Somewhere we don't talk about. No name, no timestamp. But those words held weight, because there are men who carry names, and then some men carry stories that others are too afraid to speak. As the internet dissected every pixel of the clip, the phrase began circulating in every Reddit thread, every Instagram reel caption, every quote tweet war. There are faces that need no names. Because the scars already tell the whole biography. People began to study the old man's face like it was scripture. They slowed the footage, enhanced the light, counted the number of visible marks. One jagged scar running diagonally from the top of his brow, through the cheekbone, down to where the collarbone met flesh. It wasn't fresh, it wasn't amateur, it was surgical. Deep, clean, military. Someone found an old photo in a declassified ops archive. It wasn't the same man, but the eyes. God, the eyes were exact, cold like orbit, fixed like the grip of a sniper watching history from 3 clicks out. And the narrative began to tilt. Commentators on YouTube were split. Some, like the syndicated host of Secure the Nation, barked into microphones about maintaining respect for officers risking their lives daily, while clips from soldiers, nurses, even a retired CIA analyst began flooding timelines. "I don't know who Ellis is, but if you've been around, you've heard of someone like him. Maybe even him exactly." The tension sharpened. This wasn't about a mistake anymore. This was about memory. This was about dignity, and dignity was trending. Someone on TikTok, username @AngelLinkAbool, posted a reaction clip. No music, just him watching the footage, silently. Halfway through, tears. Then he turned to the camera and whispered, "They forgot the part where Ellis saved 7 orphans when the embassy was hit. That's the man they sprayed." No footage backed that up. No official record confirmed it, but nobody questioned it, because by then, Ellis wasn't a man anymore. He was a mirror, and in him everyone saw something different. A grandfather, a teammate, a ghost from an old war, a man their father used to mention with a flicker of reverence. then fall quiet. Everyone knew someone who had been treated like Ellis, except this time the footage didn't blink. Brad Murphy, however, did, and once he did, the blowback found its way to him like a guided missile. His precinct issued a lukewarm statement, pending review, suspension with pay, awaiting full internal inquiry. But it was too late, because by then the internet had done its review. No badge, no badge number, no uniform could hide what people had seen. Clips emerged from his past, a drunk joke at a bachelor party, a clip from an old live stream of him mocking old-timers who think being in the Army makes them special, even a screen recording of a private group chat where he once typed, "Half these vets wear scars like they're gold medals." I don't buy it. That went viral too. People didn't need a prosecutor. They had context. On one screen, Ellis's eyes are like steel anchors. On the other hand, Brad's smirk crumbled into panic. Public opinion wasn't divided anymore. It was volcanic. Memes exploded across Instagram. A side-by-side of Ellis's scar and a bald eagle, with the caption, "One has wings, the other carries a country." Another read, "This man held secrets. You held a spray can." But the one that hit hardest was just a screen cap of the pinned Marine comment, superimposed over the paused frame at second 23. No effects, no music, just reality. Twitter added its fuel. A former Army captain named Valerie Montes tweeted, "If Ellis is who I think he is, I owe him my life, and Brad owes him a nation's apology." 12,000 retweets in under an hour. Soon after, a new detail surfaced. The original uploader of the clip wasn't just a bystander. He was the son of Ellis's former squad mate. He hadn't even known it was that Ellis until someone DM'd him with a black and white photo from '91. That post alone was shared over 300,000 times, with one caption that would become the anthem of the moment. "We thought we were filming a stranger. Turns out, we filmed a symbol." And once the media tried to pivot to both sides, to wait and see, they were met with something unprecedented: silence. Not the kind that kills a story, the kind that makes it sacred. No one needed CNN to explain what had happened. No one needed an analyst. No one needed experts, because the face said it all. The grainy screen, the shaking phone, but the man in the center stood still. Even now, when you pause the clip at second 23, there's a moment when the world tilts. It's not the spray, it's not the crowd, it's his eyes. Eyes that said, "I have been here before." Eyes that warned, "You don't know what you've started." Eyes that asked one question louder than any caption ever could: "And what will you do now that you've seen it?" And in the echo of that question, there was no room left for doubt. Not after the trending hashtags. Not after the old friends began to speak. Not after the stories poured in from every dark corner of the nation's forgotten wars. Because once you've seen the truth, frame by frame, you don't need subtitles. You don't need commentary. You don't need someone to tell you who the villain is. You just press play. And, the phone buzzed again. Another notification. Another headline. But no one inside the precinct was reading anymore. Not since the black SUV pulled up to the curb without plates, parked dead center like it owned the asphalt, and opened its door with the kind of silence that carried more weight than any siren. The man who stepped out didn't wear a badge. He didn't need to. His presence did the talking. His steps were unhurried, exact, as if each one had been measured long before it landed. He didn't look around, didn't check directions. He walked straight to the entrance like he had built the building, or worse, like he had once erased people inside it. At the reception desk, a young officer stood up, stammered something about protocol, but the man didn't slow down. His voice was quiet, almost casual, but it sliced through the air like a scalpel. "Where's the one who got sprayed?" The officer blinked, looked for backup, found none, then cleared his throat. "Sir, this is a restricted area. I need you to—" The words never reached the end of the sentence. The man had already turned toward the internal access door, pressed his hand flat against the biometric scanner without hesitation, and stood still. No beep, no code entered, no identification shown, and yet the door clicked open, smooth, unforced, compliant. The officer's console flashed red for a moment before displaying a line that no one in the room had ever seen before. Status: classified, inactive, no name, no clearance ID, just a statement. A warning disguised as a status. One of the lieutenants stepped forward, voice clipped, defensive. "Sir, may I ask who you are?" The man didn't answer. He kept walking. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, the kind of quiet that settles in war zones right before something irreversible begins. With each step he took, the noise in the station thinned, radios lowered, conversations died. People looked away without knowing why. He didn't carry a folder, didn't flash a credential. He carried presence. The kind that made seasoned officers straighten their backs and forget what rank meant. By the time he turned the corner into the central hallway, the precinct commander had stepped out of his office. The man in the hallway looked at him, not past him, not through him, directly into him, and asked, "Is the officer who sprayed the veteran still armed?" The commander froze. Something deep in his posture flickered. Recognition without clarity, fear without form. He opened his mouth, but before the first syllable could rise, the man removed his sunglasses. The lenses, mirrored and cold, caught the overhead lights and tilted slightly. In that reflection, the precinct commander saw something brutal. His own badge, warped and distorted by the curve of the glass, cracked in two by the bend of the frame. He couldn't explain it, but the image stopped him mid-breath. The man's eyes were steady, unreadable, ancient in their stillness. There was no anger, no heat, just that same unbearable calm. "I don't carry a file," the man said, voice low, deliberate. "I carry consequences." It wasn't said like a threat. It was said like gravity, like the last line of a classified report read aloud in a locked room, the kind that ends careers or entire departments. Officers stood still. One sergeant shifted his weight and dared to speak. "Sir, respectfully, what agency are you with?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned to face him and said, quieter this time, "You're asking the wrong question." Behind the tinted windows of the main hallway, some of the junior staff had stopped pretending to work. One of them mouthed a name under her breath, a name she wasn't sure she'd heard right, something once mentioned in a closed-door training about unidentified operatives with no formal chain of command. "He's not supposed to exist," she whispered, "but he did, and he was here." In the command center, someone tried running a full background check. The system stalled. Access error. Clearance denied. Every search led back to that same dead-end string. Restricted. Handled with Level 7 clearance. No one had ever seen Level 7. Most didn't know it existed. But now, it did. And it was walking down their hallway without breaking stride. In one of the side rooms, Brad Murphy, still suspended, still spewing excuses into the mirror of internal review, heard the hush fall over the precinct like a velvet blade. Something had changed. Not officially, not visibly, but viscerally. He sensed it. Everyone did. Outside, two journalists tried zooming through the station's glass, but caught nothing. The man had moved through the blind spots like they were painted for him. Back inside, the precinct captain, older, experienced, scarred by years and positions of uncomfortable knowledge, finally stepped forward, his voice barely above a breath. "Do I know you?" he asked. The man tilted his head. His answer came like a whisper from a courtroom sealed decades ago. "You used to have access. You signed off on briefings where my name was in black ink. You saw the redactions and chose not to ask." A beat of silence passed. The captain didn't deny it, because denial would be useless. This wasn't someone who asked for acknowledgement. This was someone who arrived after it was too late to give it. He stepped closer, not fast, not threatening, just close enough that the captain's breath caught for a reason he couldn't explain. "Tell me," the man continued, "is your officer still walking around with a loaded weapon?" The captain shook his head once. "Tight. He's been disarmed." The man didn't smile. "Good," he said, "because you don't let children play with gasoline after they've already struck the match." As he turned to leave, the air behind him seemed to change shape. Conversations didn't resume. Phones didn't ring. Even the ventilation sounded different. as if the entire building was waiting to exhale. A detective near the corner whispered, "That wasn't a visitor, that was a verdict." And he was right. The man walked past the entrance, past the desk, past the threshold where protocol used to matter. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the stares. He didn't need to, because in that silence, everyone had heard him. In that reflection, everyone had seen themselves. And though no one wrote it down, no one archived the moment, no one recorded his face or traced his name, the precinct would never forget the shape of the fear he left behind, because some men don't need a badge. Some men don't need a name, and when they walk through your door, you don't ask why they came. You ask yourself what you did wrong. Then you pray that silence is the only thing they leave behind. He had barely taken 10 steps past the precinct door when the voice rang out behind him. Not sharp, not desperate, but polished, brittle, coated in the kind of forced respect that tastes like rust. "Mr. Winston." Wait. The syllables cracked slightly on the edges, not because the man had spoken too quickly, but because he had never used that name out loud before. It didn't come naturally. It came from a memory sealed tight in the corners of a clearance file he was once allowed to read, but not annotate. The man who'd just walked through his entire command like a ghost with weight had a name. And now the precinct chief, who seconds earlier had barely held eye contact, was saying it like an apology with a title. "Sir," he tried again, stepping past his officers and out into the open, "if there's anything we can do," but the sentence trailed off under the weight of Winston's back, still facing him. Still, unrushed, unforgiving. Inside the station, Brad Murphy sat stiff in the hallway chair, still in partial uniform, eyes darting toward the open entrance, trying to match the sudden air shift to a name. "Who the hell is he?" he snapped, louder than he meant to. His voice curdled with that special kind of anger only small men produce when they sense something bigger than punishment is coming. No one answered. Not the officer beside him, not the lieutenant reviewing paperwork. Even the desk sergeant, who always had something smart to say, kept his lips sealed like fear had sutured them. Winston didn't turn. He didn't need to. He simply let the silence stretch until it grew legs, and walked into every corner of the building. Then he said, in a voice even the wind seemed to pause for, "I didn't come to collect apologies. I came to retrieve something that belongs to every man who's ever bled into a flag." He took one more step forward, still not looking at the chief. "I came to reclaim the fraction of dignity you let spill down a storm drain when you didn't intervene." The chief opened his mouth, but it was too late. Winston's words had already soaked into the floor. Brad stood, heart racing, trying to smirk, trying to puff himself back up. "Someone want to tell me what the hell is going on?" he muttered to no one in particular. Still no answers. But this time a sound did answer him. The sharp click of the precinct chief's shoes on tile, walking back into the station with shoulders straighter, jaw clenched, and a weight behind his eyes that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. He didn't speak to Brad, he didn't pull him aside, he didn't invite him into an office. He just stood in the center of the hallway, in front of everyone, and said one line without flinching. Effective immediately, Officer Bradley Murphy is placed on administrative suspension, pending full disciplinary review. Disarm him. The room snapped sideways, not from noise, but from shock. The kind that doesn't rise, it drops, hard and fast. The kind that makes time slow and blood lose its temperature. Brad stammered, "You can't be serious. What did I do wrong? I followed—" "Enough." The chief didn't raise his voice, but the word landed like a verdict. One of the internal affairs officers stepped forward, eyes uncertain, hands practiced. "Badge and weapon," he said quietly. Brad hesitated, then reached for his chest. The badge, polished and curved, clung to the fabric like it knew what was coming. His hand trembled. Not the theatrical kind, the real kind, the kind that rattles bones. As he unpinned the badge, his fingers shook like a man pulling shrapnel from his own body. It dropped into the IA officer's palm with a dull sound. No echo, but a thud that told everyone watching what had just fallen wasn't metal. It was an illusion. His gun followed next, slowly, with hesitation. The holster creaked. The weapon didn't clatter. It was placed down, as if even it knew its time was over. No one spoke. No one moved. And from the glass beyond, Winston stood at the sidewalk, arms at his sides, back straight, posture unreadable, but unmistakably trained, not in violence, in discipline, in the terrifying art of not needing to raise your voice or hand because both have already been raised too many times on the battlefield. A few younger officers glanced at each other, confusion breaking through the bravado they wore every day like uniform second skins. One of them whispered, "So that's Winston?" and got no answer, because some names you don't explain. You just remember hearing once, maybe whispered by a veteran uncle who never talked about what he did in country, maybe in a classified debrief that got shredded before coffee cooled. Back at the badge counter, Brad tried to speak again. "You don't understand." He was being aggressive. He was reaching. "I thought," the chief turned. His tone had shifted again. Not respectful now, not even formal. Cold. Judicial. The kind of voice a gavel would use if it could talk. "You thought a 70-year-old black man with a walking cane and 30 years of service to this country was a threat?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for the contempt to slide beneath the surface. "Or did you just not recognize what sacrifice looks like when it's no longer in uniform?" Brad's mouth opened, but the sound died in his throat. His hands, empty now, looked foreign, like they belonged to someone else entirely. They hung at his sides, useless, lost, like a man trying to reload a weapon that isn't his anymore. Winston finally turned, just once. No dramatic pause, no glare, just one look, and that was enough. In that glance, Brad saw the entire distance between pretending to serve and having served. He saw it, and he knew. That man had not come to threaten him. He had come to remind him what a threat used to look like, and how far beneath that bar Brad had sunk. Then came the line, clean, deadly, delivered not with hate, but with clarity that sears the skin. "The uniform doesn't give you the right to spit on a country's memory." The words landed harder than any slap, because they weren't about the law. They were about lineage. No one moved. The clock ticked. Outside, a breeze kicked up. Unremarkable to anyone else, but in that moment, it sounded like a flag rising. Not from a pole, but from the chest of a man who had just returned, not for vengeance, but for accountability. Winston didn't demand respect, he extracted it, like a surgeon pulls a foreign object from the body of a nation that forgot how to honor its spine. And when he turned and walked away, no one followed. Not because they didn't want to, but because something sacred had just passed by, something that didn't need backup or broadcast, just silence, and the kind of stillness you can only learn by standing still in places where motion gets people killed. Brad stood, badgeless, disarmed, and utterly unremarkable. His name was still stitched into his chest, but already fading in the eyes around him. One of the junior officers glanced at him, then turned away like he'd just seen a ghost, and not the impressive kind. Inside the station, the chief remained rooted to the floor. His voice, reverent now, almost reluctant, murmured into his collar mic, "Escort Winston to his vehicle. No questions, no cameras." And from behind the front desk, an old retired sergeant who had once fought in places now erased from maps whispered to no one in particular, "That wasn't a visit, that was a correction." Winston reached his SUV, opened the door without urgency, and paused, not for effect, just long enough to let the weight of what happened settle into the earth. Then he got in. No engine roar, just the slow hum of ignition and the long shadow of a man who didn't come to make noise. He came to make history, remember it, forgot someone, and he didn't need a headline to do it. Only his name, said once, carefully, by a police chief who now knew how to speak it. The fax machine began to hum just past 9:17 a.m., but this wasn't an ordinary message. It shook once, then again, not violently, but with a kind of mechanical hesitation, as if it understood the weight of what it was being asked to transmit. Inside the sealed security division of Homeland's Regional Command, the staff on duty stared at the glass panel as the paper slid out, one line at a time, each word more dangerous than the last. Classified, level 6, uninitiated, below it, a single directive in monospace type, priority protocol engaged. Commence federal restoration, proceedings for Ellis Winston. It didn't come with an explanation. It didn't need one. The header alone was enough to trigger a cascade of internal protocol trees designed for threats above human classification, situations where legacy overrides law. Within 7 minutes, a systems analyst in the Bureau's Infrastructure Division noticed that an email tagged Red Shield Archive 4D had decrypted itself without command approval. The subject line? Trust doesn't By 9:35 IMM, Brad Murphy's access badge failed to unlock the evidence control room. He tried again. Card rejected. Then the gun locker. Denied. A third attempt to log into the department server ended in a forced disconnect followed by a red alert screen that read, "Access suspended. Action pending. Internal security clearance." He stood there, blinking, lips parted, fingers still hovering over the keyboard like the system had made a mistake. But it hadn't. It wasn't a mistake. It was a purge. Targeted, controlled, absolute. Every file tagged to his name, every camera feed linked to his patrol unit, every keystroke entered in the last 48 hours, all frozen, sealed, and rerouted to an encrypted server beyond the department's visibility. No warning, no explanation, just a digital guillotine brought down in silence. Down the corridor, someone whispered into a collar mic, "Is this a DHS call?" No one answered, because the answer wasn't in the building anymore. It was above it, far above it, because the man they had dismissed, disrespected, and tried to forget had just re-entered the system not as a victim, but as a variable too high for protocol to contain. Malcolm Winston hadn't needed to kick down a door, he just needed to send a fax. Across town, an assistant producer at Channel 19 opened her inbox and paused. The subject line read, "Ellis Winston. Why he doesn't appear in any public registry." Attached was a photo, grainy, scanned from microfilm, stamped, classified/restricted/NatSec operations/20092015. She clicked once, then twice. The browser locked for 3 seconds before the metadata filtered in. Beneath the photo, a headline drafted in a still unpublished editorial, "The Ghost Who Wrote the Doctrine." Her fingers hovered over the phone, debating whether to dial legal first or press publish. She didn't get the chance, because a second email arrived before she could blink, this time from a burner account ending in .gov. Do not print. Federal hold active. This is not a request. But it was too late. Somewhere else, the story had already started writing itself. 3 verified accounts on X each, tagged as independent defense analysts, had posted threads within the same 5-minute window, all referencing a policy ghost who had helped draft veteran protection clauses during the last administration, before resigning without ceremony or statement. One of them included a partial screenshot of a redacted memorandum. Winston advised against conventional post-service clearance revocations. Stated plainly, if a veteran is not protected by the system they served, the system must be taught what loyalty means. The line echoed across feeds like a war cry no one had heard in years. The retweets surged. Hashtags lit up. Every military subreddit reopened archived posts under a new light. Back in the station, Brad sat in the internal holding cell. Glass walls, fluorescent lights, no curtains, no protection from the eyes now watching him from the outside in. His hands were still cuffed in front, not because he was under arrest, but because someone had decided he no longer deserved unsupervised reach. He looked up at the hallway cameras. They weren't blinking. Just recording, slowly, coldly, permanently. He turned to the officer posted outside and asked again, voice lower now, tighter around the edges. Who the hell is Winston? But the officer didn't speak, didn't even look at him, just kept writing on the clipboard like the question wasn't worth answering. In the main server room, an alert was fed directly to the precinct's administrative terminal. An orange security banner flashed once, then locked the screen. The line read, Federal Ono Ono, confirmed credit call locked, badge ID nullified, restriction code WINT/6. It didn't require authentication. It wasn't reversible. It was already done. And still, no one at the precinct had said his name aloud again, because by now, Winston had become something else. Not a man, not a guest, not even an agent. He was now a force that protocol couldn't question. Memory institutions were being reminded they were not allowed to erase. In a conference room inside DHS headquarters, someone placed a copy of the facts on a matte black table. The page shook slightly as the air conditioning vent overhead turned on. Small, rhythmic vibrations that gave the illusion the machine was still printing it. But the real vibration wasn't on paper. It was moving through systems, legal, military, cultural, pressing on the boundaries of what people thought accountability used to mean. A junior aide glanced at the line again. Commence federal restoration proceedings. She looked up. Sir, does this mean we're admitting error? The man across from her, a deputy undersecretary with 3 presidential citations on his chest, replied without emotion. No, it means we're trying to prevent a second one, and still, the email traffic kept climbing. From across the Pentagon network, 7 access queries hit the same archive within 15 minutes, all bouncing off the same firewall. But someone, somewhere, had already gained entry. Inside that archive were the original drafts Winston had helped edit during his tenure, paragraphs that never saw the floor, ideas that were too sharp, too blunt, too human for bureaucracy to digest. One line stood out. The uniform is not a permit for dehumanization. It is a debt marker for those willing to pay in silence. Back inside the precinct, Brad leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands, not crying, just confused, bewildered. Like a man who thought he understood the rules but had finally met the one player who helped write them. A player who had once stood behind the podium, not in front of cameras but behind the curtains, whispering what would and wouldn't become law. Now that whisper had returned, not to make new rules, but to remind everyone what happens when the old ones are betrayed. The precinct commander, now seated in his office, stared at his screen, watching the system reformat in real time. His phone hadn't rung in 23 minutes. No emails were replied to, no updates came through, but he knew what was happening. The agency above his agency had decided this was bigger than discipline. It was recalibration. A reminder, a reckoning written in digital ink and the blood of a man they had all once claimed to honor, but never protected when it mattered. Malcolm Winston didn't call for hearings. He didn't post online. He didn't give interviews. He sent one fax. And from that single signal, the system had begun to remember what it was built for. Not controlled, but service. Not silence, but the truth. And in that remembering, names were being reshuffled. Access revoked, privileges rolled back like curtains at the end of a staged lie. And those who watched from behind desks began asking themselves not what Winston wanted, but what else he knew, and whether their names would be next, because he hadn't come to punish, he had come to instruct. And in that instruction, a whole machine had been forced to pause, not out of guilt, but out of respect. It had long forgotten how to earn. The drive was quiet. No radio, no GPS, no need for spoken direction. Malcolm Winston had taken this road enough times to know that it never changed, just the names of the fallen along the way. Dust rose in slow spirals behind the SUV like the past trying to catch up. The sun hadn't dipped yet, but it hovered at the edge of the horizon like it, too, was waiting for permission to rest. When he pulled up to the small brick house, the porch light was already on, even though it wasn't yet dark. The kind of habit born not from forgetfulness, but from discipline. One of the many things Ellis Winston had never unlearned. He stepped out and closed the door softly, Not because anyone was asleep, but because some thresholds didn't deserve loud entrances. The front gate creaked when pushed, the hinges still stiff with years of weather, and the yard, trimmed but never decorated, was exactly as he remembered. Functional, honest, unapologetically plain. The kind of house that didn't advertise medals, but raised men who earned them. Inside, the air smelled like steel and wood polish. No photos on the walls, just one small bookshelf with titles about weathered wars and unweathered men. In the far corner sat a cabinet filled with citations, folded flags and medals and velvet boxes, none of which had ever been displayed in the open. The walls remained blank. They didn't need decoration, they had witnessed enough. Ellis was seated by the window, eyes tracing something invisible in the distance. His posture hadn't softened. Even age couldn't bend the spine of a man who'd never knelt for anything but the fallen. He didn't turn when Malcolm entered. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer his usual two-syllable greetings. His shirt sleeves were rolled halfway up, and on his right forearm a faint smear of dried orange still clung to the skin, a ghost of the moment when his dignity was sprayed like graffiti across public pavement. Malcolm didn't speak immediately. He walked forward and stood a few feet from his father, as if the space between them had grown a history of its own. He looked down, not from guilt, but from the weight of everything that hadn't been said. Then, finally, his voice found its place. "I'm not here to apologize for what they did to you," Malcolm said slowly, his voice neither trembling nor rehearsed. "I'm here to apologize for letting you carry the silence for 40 years. Still, Ellis didn't speak, but his jaw tightened, just enough to betray the truth, that silence hadn't been for lack of pain, it had been armor. "I thought I was honoring you by never bringing it up, by pretending the world had changed," Malcolm continued. "But I wasn't honoring you. I was hiding you. Behind stories, behind policies, behind clean offices and press briefings that never had the guts to print your name." There was a long moment where the air didn't move. Then Ellis finally turned. Not fully, just enough to show his profile. His voice came like it always had, plain, slow, but sharper than any verdict. "I forgive you," he said, the syllables stripped of emotion but full of weight. "But don't let another man's child grow up thinking they have to learn humiliation to be called a man." Malcolm nodded once. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't even relief. It was permission to do what he had come here to do. He stepped forward, pulled a handkerchief from the inner lining of his coat. Navy blue, embroidered with a subtle golden stripe only visible to those who recognized the insignia of command, and unfolded it carefully. It wasn't for display. It was part of a uniform that hadn't been worn in public since he resigned his commission. With his bare hand, he dipped the cloth into a bowl of warm water beside the chair. Then he kneeled, slowly, not ceremonially, and raised his hand to his father's arm. The paint didn't come off easily. It had been there for too long. It had dried into the grooves of scars that had their own origin stories. But Malcolm didn't rush. He didn't flinch. He scrubbed gently, but firmly, the way you clean not just skin, but memory. And as he worked, Ellis watched him, not with pride, not with tears, just with the quiet clarity of a man who had once done the same thing for his father after a march no one ever filmed. "You once told me never to pull a trigger before looking a man in the eye," Malcolm said, still cleaning. "Now I'm teaching them that again, without a rifle in my hand." Ellis didn't reply, but his eyes moved, once down to the hand that cleaned him, then to the cloth, then to the space where the last trace of orange paint finally vanished. Around them the room remained still. No television, no radio, just the ticking of an old mechanical clock near the kitchen, one of the few things Malcolm remembered from his childhood that had never stopped, never broken, never been replaced. Its sound marked the passage of time, not like a reminder, but like a warning. You don't own time, you survive it. He stood once the cloth was clean, folded it back with the same care he'd once given to field orders, and placed it in his coat pocket without ceremony. Ellis reached out then, not dramatically, not suddenly, just one hand on his son's shoulder, heavy, warm, deliberate, not to comfort, not to praise, but to acknowledge. It felt more like a transfer than a gesture, like a baton passed in a relay that never ends. His palm lingered just long enough to make the point. It was a silent inspection, a last parade, a final nod that said, "You're ready to carry what I once did." Malcolm didn't speak. He didn't need to. In that room full of medals no one wore, in a house that never needed validation, the most honored badge was invisible and had always been earned in blood, not brass. He turned to leave, not because there was nothing left to say, but because there was nothing left to prove. As he reached the door, Ellis called out, voice low but unshaken, "You remember what I said about flags?" Malcolm stopped. "Yes," he said quietly. "You said a flag can't cover a coffin and a lie at the same time." Ellis nodded once. "Good. Don't forget it, because next time they'll try." And with that, Malcolm Winston walked out, not just as a man who had reclaimed dignity for his father, but as one who had just been cleared by history itself to deliver a lesson this country had spent too long avoiding. He didn't carry a badge. He didn't need one, because his name had already become a standard. And sometimes, the highest authority in a nation doesn't wear a title on its chest. It walks out the front door of a small brick house with paint still drying behind it, and silence heavy in its wake. The lights in the conference room were too bright, too white, too indifferent. 4 agencies, 1 rectangular table, and 12 people who all looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Veterans Affairs, the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, FBI, no placards, no names on screens, no coffee on the table, just a silence that settled like smoke after an explosion, waiting to see if the fire had truly gone out. Malcolm Winston sat at the far end, not in the spotlight, not under a title, just there, immovable, wearing a charcoal suit that looked too calm for a man who had, in the last 72 hours, flipped an entire chain of command on its back. He had no laptop, no legal pad, no recording device, only a thin folder and a stare that didn't shift. The Deputy Director of Homeland Security cleared his throat, trying to soften what was about to be a losing argument. "Mr. Winston, I want to make it clear from the outset that Officer Murphy's conduct is under formal departmental review. We've initiated preliminary suspension protocols and—" Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He simply reached into the folder and pressed a remote on the table. The screen behind him lit up without ceremony. A muted video began to play. The image quality was poor, handheld, a cell phone, time-stamped July 3, 2021. In the video, a man, dirty, gaunt, shivering, stood by a Greyhound terminal in Atlanta. His coat bore a faded U.S. Army patch. He looked confused, speaking to no one in particular. Then came the slap, quick, brutal, delivered by a uniformed officer with no hesitation and no words. The man fell sideways. No arrest, no paperwork, just a homeless veteran who disappeared into the concrete. The officer in the frame was unmistakable. Brad Murphy. There was no narration, no opinion, just the image of what everyone had allowed. The room held its breath, not out of shock, but because no one could claim they hadn't seen something like it before. Malcolm's voice was calm. That footage was buried in a precinct's internal server and mislabeled as a civil disruption, with no charges filed and no supervisory escalation. The victim died of exposure 4 months later. No one spoke. One VA official flinched. The woman from the DOJ scribbled something meaningless, just to have something to do with her hands. Someone in the back whispered to their colleague, "I thought Winston was off-grid. Wasn't he dropped from all tactical roster?" The FBI liaison, older, neck tight in his collar, whispered back, "He was. That's what makes this worse." The projector clicked off. The silence remained. Malcolm didn't look at anyone in particular when he spoke again. "The man who was sprayed on the street was my father, but I'm not here for an apology. I'm here so you learn how to be afraid of the next time you let this happen." He slid a 12-page dossier down the table. It didn't slide fast. It scraped. It passed through too many hands to be an accident. Each page was a signature, a timestamp, a name. These are the people who signed off on Murphy's reactivation after 3 conduct violations. after a flagged psychological report, after he was warned by an internal monitor for escalating during civilian encounters. The file passed again. Some skimmed, some didn't dare. The pages turned, like a priest reading sins off a list no one could deny. The deputy chief of VA cleared his throat and said, "We'll launch a full-tier audit of those authorizations. Independent counsel. No interference." Malcolm didn't respond. He didn't blink. He simply said, "I've already launched it." A Homeland lawyer asked, voice trembling beneath his practiced neutrality, "Are you asking for prosecution?" Malcolm's answer was sharper than steel. "I'm asking for a system that doesn't need prosecutions to remember what decency looks like." Someone exhaled. Someone else whispered a curse. A low-ranking OIG agent muttered, "He was just beat, cop. Why does it feel like we're tearing down a federal wall to explain him?" Because they were. Because Winston hadn't arrived with accusations, he arrived with proof, with video, with files, with names, and with a kind of power that didn't need legal justification. It only needed memory. And memory, when wielded by someone who had once written policy instead of following it, was more terrifying than any badge in the room. The final moment came without gavel or declaration. Malcolm stood, slowly, without rustling his suit or raising his voice. He walked toward the exit but paused with one hand on the doorknob. "I'm not trying to redeem the system," he said without looking back. "Redemption is for those who suffer. I'm here to make sure the ones who created that suffering never feel safe again." Then, quieter, so quiet it felt like a sentence whispered through the drywall of every institution in the country, "I don't want them to apologize to my father. I want them to fear repeating him." The door opened, then closed, and what remained in the room wasn't a decision. It was a reckoning no one could write a report about, because the hand that exposed it had never needed to be visible, to be felt. It began like so many other revelations in America, not with a whistleblower, not with a courtroom, not with a confession under oath, but with a mechanic reviewing surveillance footage at closing time, trying to figure out who had knocked over a trash bin near Bay 2. The video file, pulled from a single fisheye camera mounted high above the garage awning, was grainy and silent, designed more for theft deterrence than history. But at 13:04 and 28 seconds, the man reviewing it stopped moving. On screen, just outside the edge of the bay door, stood two men. One wore a dark uniform, the other held a cane. The officer gestured toward the older man, stepped forward, and then, with clinical indifference, raised his boot and crushed the cane beneath his foot. There was no audio, no sound of the crack, no voice to tell the story, but the picture was too exact, too merciless, too symbolic to ignore. The wooden cane broke with clean finality, splitting into two halves on the pavement, and as it rolled, one side flipped upward just enough for the etched letters to show. The camera caught them. Ellis, 1971. That was all. The rest was context that the country already knew too well. The mechanic didn't hesitate. He sent the clip to a friend at a local station, and within 4 hours, the footage had passed through 3 newsroom inboxes, 6 advocacy groups, and a former Marine's private Discord server. By nightfall, it was viral. 38 seconds. No dialogue, no narration, just silence, posture, and a fracture that echoed through the country like a broken oath. No one needed to explain what it meant. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a revelation, delivered without subtitles. The man who had sprayed an old veteran on the sidewalk hadn't just lost control, hadn't just overstepped. He had desecrated something sacred, visibly, publicly, and with the kind of contempt that cameras were never supposed to catch. But this time they did. And what the nation saw wasn't just brutality, it was something colder. The certainty of a man who believed no one would hold him accountable, even with a lens on him. The video didn't show Brad Murphy yelling, cursing, or threatening. It didn't need to. His face said everything, detached, mechanical, confident, like he had done it before. As he turned to walk away, the reflection of the garage lights followed his footsteps, smooth, uninterrupted, but the shadow he left behind on the concrete wall did not. The shadow broke. A perfect vertical interruption split his silhouette. as if the moment of violence had severed not just the cane, but the illusion of authority cast around him. Viewers noticed. Frame by frame, freeze by freeze, millions watched that shadow bend and falter. It became the visual metaphor no editor dared write into words. The next morning, national news stations ran the clip without commentary. CNN labeled it evidence without excuse. MSNBC called it the silent verdict. But it was the conservative bastion, the Sentinel, a paper that had defended officer conduct in over 90% of their editorials, that delivered the headline heard across precincts, "He doesn't deserve the badge." Underneath, in small print, a second video has surfaced of Officer Brad Murphy, in uniform, destroying a cane belonging to a decorated war veteran. The cane was inscribed with the name Ellis, confirmed to be the father of Malcolm Winston, former National Defense Policy Advisor. It was the first time the outlet had named the victim without hesitation. It was also the first time in over a decade they had referred to a law enforcement officer by last name alone, without title, without rank, without reverence. Within 6 hours, over 3 million users had shared the footage. Hashtags surged. Evidence without excuse. Ellis 1971. That cane was Ismetal. In comments and forums, people didn't ask what had happened. They already knew. What they asked was, why did it take a silent video to make people listen? A user on Reddit wrote, "It wasn't just a cane, it was the last piece of a man who gave this country everything, and all it took was one boot to erase it." Another added, "You don't need sound when the crime speaks for itself." Lip readers got to work. Several videos circulated with analyses of Brad's mouth movement in the clip. One phrase repeated itself in dozens of overlays, enhanced and slowed. "You're lucky you're still breathing." There was no way to confirm it audibly, but the synchronization was undeniable. The tilt of his chin, the curling of his lip, the deliberate separation of the words, "You're lucky you're still breathing." Those 6 words, silent, poisonous, irreversible, were heard louder than a courtroom gavel. They weren't a mistake. They were an ideology. And no policy, no procedural defense, no department-issued press release could bury them. For the first time since the case began, every public official asked to comment on the incident offered only one answer: "We are reviewing the footage in full," but no one needed more time. The footage didn't call for an investigation, it called for reckoning. In one of the rawest reactions, a retired Navy SEAL tweeted, "That cane was worth more than his badge." The tweet was shared over 200,000 times in less than a day. Beneath it, someone replied with a still image of the broken shadow, writing, "Even his conscience couldn't keep up with his footsteps." On Capitol Hill, a congressman who had initially defended Officer Murphy publicly retracted his statement, calling the footage damning and deeply un-American. Several precincts across state lines released statements clarifying their zero-tolerance policies on disrespect toward veterans, whether verbal or physical. But the public wasn't listening to policy anymore. The public had seen what the system looked like when no one expected to be watched, and it didn't forgive easily. When a badge crushes a name, and the nation sees it happen, there is no briefing strong enough to silence the aftermath. There is only memory. And memory doesn't need volume. It needs images. The cane, the crack, the silence, the shadow. Malcolm Winston did not speak to the press that day. He didn't need to. The country was already reciting the words he never had to write, that this wasn't about reform or lawsuits or accountability metrics. It was about a scar the nation could finally see with its own eyes, and for once, no one could look away. In the final still frame circulated on every major network that evening, the cane lay broken on the concrete, its name face down, as if shielding itself from what the country had become. Above it, Brad's boots mid-step, and beside him, the fractured shadow, a visual requiem, not for one man, but for what the badge was never supposed to protect: arrogance without cost, no sound, no voice, no defense. Just evidence that silence, once caught on camera, can say everything. It didn't begin with a ceremony or a press conference or even an official apology. It began with a document, unclassified, unsigned by any politician, unearthed by a single lined-item review deep inside the Department of Defense archives. The file was dated August 1972, marked Nominated Man Silver Star, and beneath the redacted cover sheet, the name was typed in uniform font, Ellis Winston. No rank, no flourish, just name and circumstance. The commendation had never been approved. Buried, deferred, labeled pending further evaluation before being quietly shelved during an administrative reshuffle that made political loyalty matter more than battlefield valor. For nearly half a century, no one had spoken of it, until now. Once made public, the files spread faster than the video. Journalists who had once written about gun violence, corruption, and war now turned their attention to a forgotten recommendation that should have ended in Arlington. Not in a back closet of federal silence. Then came the letter, unsigned at first, typed on clean stationery, attributed only to a general who once led the men who bled under Winston's command. Within hours, the writer revealed himself, retired General Walter Keyes, 3-time Bronze Star recipient, former deputy commander of U.S. Forces Pacific. His words were exact. If I still wore the uniform, Ellis Winston would already have a place carved in Arlington marble. This country doesn't have enough walls for the names we've erased. No hashtags, no campaign slogans, just truth, weighty and irreversible. That sentence became the cornerstone of a growing wave across social and legacy media. The New York Times ran a black and white front-page header, "Name him right," above a full-spread article tracing Winston's years of undocumented service in regions where no press was allowed. VA clinics began taping printouts of his photo at reception desks. Local news stations reran the clip of the broken cane, now juxtaposed with a photo of a young soldier in Vietnam, his rifle slung, his eyes looking just slightly off camera, as if already staring into a future that wouldn't know what to do with him. It was that photo, Ellis at 23, that Malcolm found one morning folded into a manila envelope on his porch, sent anonymously without a message. He recognized the eyes immediately, his own, except quieter, sharper, hardened not by outrage but by endurance. That photo was printed and framed not by Malcolm, not by the VA, but by a junior staffer who had never met either man, but knew enough to walk into headquarters and hang it without asking. No plaque, no engraved caption, just the image, placed in the lobby where everyone entering had to face it. And for the first time in 40 years, someone stood guard beside it. Not assigned, not ordered, just there, by choice, in silent tribute. When a CBS anchor asked Malcolm for an interview, he declined. When NPR requested a profile, he didn't respond. When a group of veterans invited him to speak at their national gathering, he sent only one sentence, typed without formatting, centered on the page. My father's name, written in lowercase, still makes men stand at attention. That line became a rallying cry, not in anger, but in reverence. It was printed on T-shirts, carved into murals, whispered during candlelight vigils held not in cemeteries, but in neighborhoods where forgotten soldiers still lived alone, invisible, unrewarded. And as the country shifted, slowly, shamefully, toward restitution, a final gesture emerged without coordination. People began mailing flowers, not to the Pentagon, not to the City Hall, but to a quiet house with no neon, no flagpole, no mailbox nameplate. Just a wooden fence and a concrete porch in the same neighborhood Ellis had walked every morning for 30 years without fanfare. That night, over 100 bouquets appeared. Red, white, wildflowers, poppies, not arranged, not labeled, just left, as if the nation, unsure of how to say sorry, had finally remembered how to bow. Inside the house, Ellis said nothing. He didn't need to, because names don't earn honor from the weight of capital letters. They earn it from the people who remember them when the country forgets. He didn't ask for his name to be capitalized in a headline. He never needed a title, a rank, or a parade. He had a cane, a scar, and a silence he carried longer than most wars last. That was his monument. That was his inscription. And now it was enough to shake the ground beneath institutions that had tried to make him invisible. They had written his name small, but it stood taller than theirs ever would. And in the end, when history is printed, it won't be bold font that matters. It'll be the names no one dared erase. The submission came in at 6:47 a.m. time-stamped on an encrypted DoD server labeled Intelligency Review, Level 5, routed through internal clearance pathways typically reserved for wartime overrides or presidential briefings. It was titled plainly, Memorandum 67A, Recognition Petition for Unacknowledged Valor. The author was listed as Winston, Malcolm R., civilian advisor, retired. The contents, however, were anything but civilian. Attached were 94 pages of cross-referenced records, declassified mission logs, affidavit-style testimonies from surviving unit members, and 2 photographs dated 1971 of one showing Ellis Winston dragging a wounded lieutenant under gunfire toward an extraction point outside Fuak Bin, the other showing that same lieutenant saluting Ellis from a field stretcher moments before the commendation paperwork had been started, then stalled, then forgotten. No signature, no rejection. Just erasure through red tape until now. The final paragraph of Malcolm's memorandum read, "A government that can send a man to die must at least remember the name it almost buried him under." There was no flourish, no pleading, just a fact, nailed down like a coffin lid. Meanwhile, in another wing of the system that still believed in pretending consequences could be paused, the name Brad Kinley, formerly known to the public as Officer Brad Murphy, was being reviewed for internal disciplinary proceedings. On paper, the charges were damning: abuse of power, destruction of property, conduct unbecoming. Yet the tone inside the room was anything but decisive. Kinley sat behind layers of procedural armor, propped up by the full weight of the Regional Law Enforcement Association, which had issued an immediate statement labeling the disciplinary inquiry politically motivated and prejudicial to officers under public pressure. They called him a scapegoat. They called him a target. But no one called him what he was. Not yet. That would come later, because by the time the disciplinary committee received the second envelope, the damage was already spreading. The envelope was simple, white, sealed with no insignia. Inside, a printout of the same Memorandum 67A, along with a handwritten note in clean, symmetrical cursive. This file was not written for your approval. It exists to remind you that some records bleed. The committee chairman dismissed it as theatrics, until the call came through. Not from a secretary, not from an aide, from Winston himself. No press, no entourage, just a voice, cold, controlled, final. "That file isn't for your review," Malcolm said, each word spaced like bullet casings hitting marble. "It wasn't built to be read. It was built so you'd be afraid of what it reveals." The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Winston," with respect, but he never finished, because Winston did. Some men get sprayed with paint. Others live entire lives not worth a single stroke of ink. Don't confuse the difference. Across town, the leak happened with surgical precision. One unnamed source, one document. A single detail dropped into a journalist's inbox like a landmine. Brad Kinley had never served. Worse, he had actively avoided the draft during an active enlistment call-up by forging exemption papers using his father's veteran ID. It wasn't hearsay. It wasn't conjecture. It was notarized in 2002 by a clerk who had assumed the claim was valid. No one checked, no one questioned, no one cared, until now. The media ran the headline like a verdict. The badge he earned was built on a name he stole. Within hours, the original ID submission was located in a digital archive, a scanned form. Signature, Kinley, Brad. Underneath, immediate family of combat veteran, hardship exemption requested. The exemption was granted. The lie was buried. And now, the man who crushed the cane of a real soldier had done so while hiding behind the paperwork of a war he never dared to face. The internet erupted, for once not with outrage alone, but with cold, factual fury. Hashtags became subpoenas, screenshots became exhibits, comment sections turned into tribunals. And in the committee room where Brad now sat, arms crossed and smirk slowly fading, a new file was placed on the table, thicker than the others, heavier, sealed with a single red stamp that hadn't been used in over a decade, unfit for badge. The panel went silent. One woman leaned forward, looked at the name on the front, and read it aloud with the kind of tone usually reserved for reading eulogies. Kinley, Brad. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at him. She just stared at the folder, then pushed it forward like it was radioactive. Malcolm watched from a monitor, arms folded, not blinking, not speaking. He didn't need to be in the room. His work was already there, in every unspoken sentence, in every file that had been reopened not for justice but for correction, in the fear that now pulsed through a committee trained to feel invincible behind procedure. There was no debate. No call for delay, not because Kinley had been found guilty in court, but because his story no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the stain he left on a name better than his, a name he could never carry, a name he once stepped on in broad daylight and didn't think the world would care to remember. But it had. It remembered everything: the boot, the cane, the silence, the broken shadow, and now the paperwork. The Department of Defense confirmed receipt of Memorandum 67A 3 days later. The response was brief: under active review for retroactive commendation. Process expedited under authority of joint directive. No apology, no denial, just movement. Because when systems move under pressure, it's not out of mercy. It's out of recognition that something bigger than law has entered the room. Memory weaponized by fact. Malcolm issued no statement. He appeared on no broadcast. When asked for a comment by a national network, he sent only one line: some names never deserved a file. Some files were never meant to be read, but they will be paid for. That sentence spread faster than any headline, because it wasn't just a closing argument. It was a promise, a signature on a contract no one else had dared to draft, the kind written in red ink and silence, the kind that turns a system inward, makes it flinch, and forces it to calculate what it can no longer ignore. Kinley didn't respond to the leak. His lawyers released a 2-sentence statement blaming character assassination and unauthorized disclosures, but no one listened. Not this time, because this time, the silence of the victim had become the language of the nation, and in that silence, everyone heard the same thing. This wasn't about making a file public. It was about making shame permanent. The last thing placed on the table wasn't a file. It was the cane, reassembled, glued at the fracture, cleaned of paint, still bearing the name Ellis 1971. It sat there, not as evidence, not as a prop, but as a monument. And in that moment, every man in the room understood. No badge, no union, no signed paper could restore what had been broken, but they could be made to remember it, and that, Malcolm knew, was enough for now. The room wasn't large, but it felt cavernous. It wasn't cold, but no one could seem to breathe. It wasn't empty, yet not a single word filled the space when the clerk finally said, "All rise." The sound of wooden chairs shifting echoed like a ritual too old to remember, too scripted to feel real. And when Brad Kinley walked in, no longer shielded by patrol lights or precinct glass, wearing a suit too pressed for a man too cracked, the silence deepened. Not out of respect, but out of calculation. People were trying to figure out how someone so ordinary had left a wound so permanent. The judge, middle-aged, great-templed, carried a voice that neither invited nor threatened. She read the charges like reading off a menu no one had the stomach to order from: misconduct, dereliction, abuse of public trust. The list was long, but the tone was short, because this wasn't about criminal sentencing anymore. It was about moral clarity, and clarity doesn't require a gavel to be heard. Brad didn't flinch when the first question was posed. "Do you wish to offer any apology or statement regarding your conduct?" His lawyer remained seated by mutual decision. No cross-examination, no motion to dismiss, just one man, one microphone, and an entire nation watching from screens that had already judged him. Brad cleared his throat. He spoke slowly, carefully, like a man who had practiced not the truth, but the phrasing. "I only did what I was trained to do," he said. "I followed procedure. I kept order. I didn't act with hatred. I acted out of responsibility." He paused, as if expecting to hear murmurs of understanding. None came, only the sound of a pencil breaking quietly 3 rows back. Then he continued, "I will not apologize for doing my job. If anything, the system should apologize to me for being left to deal with the kind of chaos we're not prepared to manage anymore. That was it. No regret, no humility, just the exhausted self-justification of a man who still believed control was righteousness. And then, before the judge could respond, someone in the gallery stood. He wasn't young. He wasn't tall. His jacket was loose over one shoulder, the other sleeve pinned and empty, cut clean above the elbow. The stump trembled as he lifted it, pointing directly at the defendant. His voice, when it came, was not theatrical. It was sanded down by years of swallowing back rage. "I was one of the men who kept the chaos from reaching your borders," he said, "and I lost my arm so that one day someone like you could wear that badge and protect what we fought for. It didn't protect anything. You spit on it." His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from memory. "Don't talk to me about responsibility. I carried it into places you've only seen in war documentaries. You don't know the meaning of that word. And the man whose cane you shattered, he carried more dignity in that stick than you have in your whole career." He sat down without waiting for permission. The room didn't applaud. The room didn't blink. It simply froze, suspended in the kind of reverence that silence demands. At the far end of the bench, Ellis Winston stood. No prompt, no introduction, no oath. He wore a coat older than the courtroom's carpet and shoes that had long since given up trying to shine. He walked to the table, not toward the defendant, not toward the judge, but toward the center, and there, with the slowness of ritual, he removed a single item from his pocket, a badge. Not a police badge, not a military one either, just a circular pin, dull gold, engraved with a number and a year no one under 30 would recognize. He didn't speak, he didn't lift it, he didn't announce what it was. He simply placed it flat on the table and said, low enough for the microphone to barely catch it, "I don't need this anymore. I no longer know what it represents." That was all. The judge didn't move. The stenographer stopped typing. The guards stiffened. And the badge, small, quiet, unnoticed for decades, became the loudest thing in the room. Because it didn't just sit there. It accused, not with words, with presence, with weight, with the history no one had bothered to write until now. Brad tried to shift in his seat, but the sound of the badge hitting the table had already landed harder than any sentence a court could offer. That sound would be played on loop, clipped into videos, slowed in documentaries, referenced in Senate hearings, because that moment was when everything shifted. That was when no one could hide behind training manuals or tactical jargon. That was when the public stopped looking for policy and started looking for character. And when they looked at Brad, all they saw was the absence of it. The judge cleared her throat, not to restore order, but because she didn't know how to follow what had just been left on her bench. Then came the closing remark, not from Ellis, not from Malcolm, but from the chair of the Veteran Oversight Committee, seated among the panel of observers. A man who had spent 30 years writing policy briefs on battlefield ethics. He looked at the table, then at the defendant, and said simply, "When justice needs defending to excuse humiliation, then law is no longer justice. It's just a shield for cowards." The gavel fell, but no one stood, because justice had already been delivered, without sentencing, without verdict, without ceremony. It had arrived in the shape of an old badge, no longer wanted by the man who earned it, and now impossible to wear by those who never deserved one. And as the bailiffs cleared the room, as the judge exited without eye contact, as the defendant was escorted not to prison, but to paperwork, to hearings, to a life no longer able to hide behind its title, the badge remained, unclaimed, untouched, illuminated by a single shaft of sunlight breaking through a window that none of them had noticed until now. It glinted, faintly, then dulled again, but no one would forget where it lay, because from this day forward, every trial after would carry its echo, and every man who dared call himself a protector would first have to ask, whose dignity am I defending? The silence after Ellis Winston stood, after the badge was left alone on that cold courtroom table, wasn't broken by any gavel or ruling or oath. It was broken by a voice from the third row, low but unwavering. cutting through the tension like a forgotten truth returning from exile. And when the judge glanced up, unsure if the voice had spoken out of turn, a woman stepped forward with the kind of composure that didn't request permission but rendered it irrelevant. She wasn't listed on the docket, her name wasn't included in any statement, but her badge, military agent, laminated, old, hung from her neck with the quiet authority of someone who had seen enough blood to know when a wound was not on the body, but in the system. Her name was Helen Kinley, and she introduced herself not by title, not by relation, but with a simple declaration, "I served as an Army nurse, Field Unit Laos, 1971. The air changed. Brad's head turned, and when she said the next line, it wasn't a revelation, it was a reckoning disguised as fact. "I was there when Ellis Winston carried your father into our hospital tent, chest shredded by shrapnel. Unconscious, presumed dead, no medevac available, no air cover, no radio." Her voice didn't shake. "He carried your father for nearly 4 kilometers under fire, barefoot, bleeding, and never asked for credit. Your father lived because that man didn't leave him in the dirt. And now you've left your name in it. No one breathed, not the judge, not the audience, not even Brad, who sat frozen, jaw locked, expressionless, in a way that wasn't strength, but paralysis." Helen continued, "I never told you because you never asked. You never cared who saved your bloodline. You wore a badge, but never looked behind it. You stood on a name you never earned, and when you spat on Mr. Winston, you weren't attacking a stranger. You were desecrating the man who gave you a father to grow up with." Brad tried to stand, not urgently, not defiantly, but as if he could somehow escape the ground itself, as if physical distance could offer shelter from moral collapse. But the security officer behind him didn't even raise a hand. The tension of the room alone forced him back into the chair. No one stopped him. No one needed to, because no one in that courtroom saw him as a man anymore. He was now just an interruption, a failed inheritance of a legacy he never understood, standing exposed under the weight of a truth that didn't need volume to crush him. Helen stepped back without drama, without applause, and returned to her seat like a torchbearer whose flame had already caught. The judge said nothing, could say nothing, because what had just been spoken wasn't an allegation. It was a mirror held up to an entire system that had trained itself to ignore the weight of memory until it burned through steel. Ellis never turned. He didn't look at Brad once. He didn't need to, because what was left to see had already been said. Brad sat there, his hands not cuffed but trembling, his throat too tight to swallow, his spine no longer straight like it used to be behind the shield of authority. He was no longer Officer Kindley, no longer the defender, no longer even a son, because now the room knew that the only part of his identity worth carrying had been borrowed from a man he had publicly humiliated, and now even his name wasn't his anymore. Reporters stopped referring to him as Brad. Legal filings simply listed the respondent. Members of the community used phrases like "the man who sprayed him," or, more often, "that one," not out of cruelty, but precision, because a name is not just what you're given, it's what you preserve, and he had done neither. He hadn't guarded it, he hadn't earned it, he had weaponized it, and now it was being reclaimed by the truth he couldn't silence. People didn't look at him like an outcast. They looked at him like a cautionary tale. Even the officers who once stood in solidarity had shifted in their seats, eyes averted, backs stiffer, not out of loyalty, but out of discomfort, because there's something unnatural about watching someone fall from a platform they built themselves. And yet, it wasn't a spectacle, it wasn't public shaming, it was the consequence, and that, above all, is what no uniform can protect against, because consequences don't care about rank. It doesn't care about unions or procedure. It only cares about weight, about debt. And today, every ounce of silence Ellis Winston had carried for 5 decades had found its way back to the one man who mistook silence for weakness. The judge called for a recess, not because it was scheduled, but because there was no legal vocabulary to proceed from. but no one moved. The room remained seated, motionless, like something sacred had happened, and no one wanted to be the first to betray it by walking away. And as Brad sat there, small, surrounded, finally seen, he realized that the trial had never been about charges. It had never been about testimony. It had always been about reversal, not a legal reversal, moral, historical, cultural, the kind that doesn't just expose a man, it empties him of myth, of entitlement, of name. And as he reached for the water on the table, his hand still shaking, not a single person in the room offered him a look of compassion, not because they wanted to punish him, but because they had nothing left to give. He wasn't them. He had betrayed something older than policy. He had betrayed the chain of meaning, of sacrifice, of earned dignity. And when that chain breaks, no institution can restore it. Ellis walked out first, not quickly, not slowly, but with the kind of posture that doesn't demand respect but receives it by default. He didn't say a word, he didn't acknowledge the crowd, he just left. But his absence filled the room more than any presence could, because once the truth has been spoken, everything else is noise, and now even the noise had fled. Brad remained seated, but he wasn't sitting in a courtroom anymore. He was sitting in judgment, not of him, but of everything he represented, the system that promoted him, the papers that shielded him, the badges that never questioned his name. And now, even that name was a liability. When a reporter later asked Malcolm why Ellis hadn't responded to the revelation, he said only, "He's seen too many endings. He knows the shape of one even before it falls," and fall it did, not with fire, not with fury, but with the slow, irreversible unraveling of a man who thought the law would shield him from the truth. But truth doesn't need permission. It doesn't need permission to speak, or to hurt, or to rewrite. It just waits until one woman stands up in the third row and says what everyone else has spent years pretending they didn't know. The man who got sprayed had once saved the bloodline of the man who held the can. And that spray didn't just land on a veteran's skin. It landed on the same last name Brad Kinley had spent his entire life walking on, wearing, claiming, and now fleeing. Because from that moment forward, he didn't wear it. It wore him. And not one soul in the courtroom was willing to lift it off his shoulder. The call came at 7:12. Amen. Not through a press secretary, not from an aide, not via memo or middleman, but directly, line to line, secure, unmistakable. Malcolm Winston answered without ceremony. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't straighten his collar. He listened. And when the President of the United States, voice solemn, respectful, measured, extended the highest civilian honor the country could offer to his father, Malcolm said what he had rehearsed in his head for years, but never believed he'd have to speak aloud. He doesn't need a medal. He needs a country that doesn't wait 50 years to remember who carried it. He doesn't need a ceremony. He needs continuity. He needs to know that the paint they sprayed on his body won't be rinsed off with applause, but with accountability. The line went quiet for a breath, just long enough to signal discomfort, but not long enough to allow retreat. Then came the second offer, a formal event at the Capitol. National press, bipartisan attendance, the president himself ready to stand shoulder to shoulder. Malcolm listened again, then replied, calm but final, "You want to honor him? Then repaint the walls of the precinct, not the ribbon of a medal. Rewrite the funding lines, audit the disciplinary loopholes. Make it so no man wearing Ellis Winston's name ever needs to defend it again in a courtroom. Because the one who knew how to carry this country already did, without cameras." Still, the White House moved forward. The public demanded a gesture. News anchors repeated the word rectification like a chant. Social pressure surged. And so the stage was set. The National Mall, a podium draped in blue, a velvet box resting on its cushion. Rows of seats, journalists, military brass, lawmakers who had voted against VA expansion bills are now adjusting their lapel pins. But there was no Ellis Winston. There was no Malcolm. Only an empty chair on the stage, and a sealed envelope addressed to the office of the president, delivered by hand the morning of the event. Inside was an old military cap, worn thin, still marked faintly with the orange stain that the nation had come to recognize as its shame. The card attached read, "Do not award me, erase the need for men like me to ever have to be remembered like this." No one spoke for a while. The cameras panned. The velvet box remained unopened. The cap sat on the podium, not placed ceremonially but left, as if by a man too tired to keep carrying it, and for a moment the crowd didn't see a tribute, they saw a warning. The cap looked like a grave marker, but there was no death to mourn, only an awakening too long postponed. Even the president, poised and polished, hesitated, then lowered his head, not in performance, but in something close to reverence or guilt or perhaps both. That night, no headlines celebrated the medal, no op-eds debated policy. The photograph that flooded the nation was not of a handshake or a smile. It was of a podium, a cap, a shadow behind the seal of the country, a country reminded, not by voice but by absence, that some names aren't missing, they're resisting. And somewhere far from the lights, Ellis Winston sat on his porch, hatless, his badge long gone, watching the sky like someone who had returned from a place the nation still hadn't caught up to. He didn't need applause. He needed proof, and until then he would not stand for anything, not even a medal, because the real burden was never in the silence. It was in waiting to see whether the country had finally learned how to speak his name, not in gold, but in policy, in dignity, in ink that couldn't be washed away by time, or by shame, or by another failed promise disguised as honor. The call from the president faded into memory, not with fanfare, but with a stillness that lingered longer than applause ever could. And days after the ceremony that honored absence more than presence, a new fragment emerged, not from policy, not from press, but from an anonymous phone recording captured on a quiet sidewalk, time-stamped 43 seconds after Ellis Winston had turned his back on the last camera that tried to follow him. The clip was only 8 seconds long. No music, no narration, just a man, crouched, calm, steady, bowing his head to wipe his shoes with a torn piece of cloth still stained faintly by the orange paint that had once been sprayed on him like a dismissal. In the blurred background stood a small child, maybe 8, wearing a school uniform, standing upright, still, not because anyone told him to, but because instinct told him he was watching something sacred. That was it. 8 seconds, and the world moved. The video didn't go viral like a scandal. It moved like weather. Slow, steady, uninvited, but inescapable. First, a few shares on veteran boards, then educators reposted it, then activists, then journalists, not with headlines, but with captions like, "This is what dignity looks like when no one is looking." The image of Ellis, head down, shoe in hand, a child in silhouette behind him, began playing before every Memorial Day parade, projected in silence before national anthems, broadcast not as spectacle, but as calibration. He wasn't delivering a speech. He wasn't holding a flag. He was reminding the country how to stand, not with words, but with posture, not with power, but with presence, because there are people who don't need to speak, but make everyone else feel they're being too loud, too proud, too late. In a high school in Pittsburgh, a teacher projected the image in his civics class. A student asked, "Who is that man?" The teacher said, "That is the moment we stopped pretending silence was indifference." Weeks later, the school board voted to rename the main auditorium. It wasn't debated. It wasn't opposed. It was simply done. The new bronze letters read, Ellis Winston Hall, Quiet Strength. The plaque beneath said, "Not every hero marches. Some just refuse to fall." Malcolm Winston didn't attend the dedication. He didn't need to. He hadn't spoken publicly since the ceremony he had never walked into. He hadn't written another op-ed. No books, no interviews, just one final status on his dormant account. "I have finished. The rest is not mine to carry." Beneath it, no hashtags, no explanation. Just a single image. The 8-second clip frozen at second 6, Ellis leaning forward, the child behind him, shadow tall, chest out, learning not how to speak, but how to honor. That post stayed pinned for months. No updates followed. People began sharing it not as content, but as a checkpoint, as if to ask themselves, are we louder than we need to be? Are we doing enough or just being seen enough? It didn't trend. It didn't disappear. It lingered. Meanwhile, law enforcement trainings across 3 states incorporated the clip into orientation seminars. Not as part of legal code, but as moral footage. Recruits were asked to sit in silence for those 8 seconds before being allowed to speak. Some called it unnecessary. Most didn't. One cadet, when asked why he was crying, simply replied, "I've never felt more ashamed of how loudly we justify things." There were no new laws passed in Ellis Winston's name. No monuments were built, but a precinct quietly repainted its walls. A city council rewrote its complaint thresholds. A mayor sent an apology letter, not for what happened in his jurisdiction, but for not stopping what happened everywhere. None of it was coordinated. All of it was the consequence. Because some men teach by raising their voices, and some teach by lowering their heads, and when that man lowers his head to clean his shoes, and behind him stands a child learning how stillness can carry more honor than noise, the whole country remembers, even if it didn't mean to. The clip of Ellis Winston adjusting his shoes had faded from the trending lists, but not from the culture it quietly rewrote. And while the nation adjusted to its new vocabulary of reverence, one name began to disappear again, not from indifference but by choice. Malcolm Winston refused every interview, every panel invitation, every keynote request. He declined tributes, award ceremonies, and honorary degrees. Emails bounced. Phones rang unanswered. His social accounts were archived, then deleted. Journalists speculated. Officials speculated. But Malcolm had done what very few men in power ever managed to do. He stepped away entirely. And that vacuum didn't make him forget. It made him a legend. Then came the leak. Not a scandal. Not a slip, but a line buried in a classified Pentagon memo declassified by accident during a routine FOIA request. The line read, Operational Command, Task Group Omega, Oversight, Winston Malcolm R. Yemen, 2016, Ukraine, 2019. Special Directive Clearance, terminated upon personal request. The memo wasn't redacted. It wasn't erased. It was ignored for years because no one thought the man who dismantled an entire system with restraint once commanded black flag missions. No news outlet had ever been allowed to report. But the story spilled. Slowly, reports emerged. Former analysts confirmed Malcolm wasn't just an advisor. He was the man who wrote the orders that ended wars before they started, who neutralized threats not with bullets but with pressure, strategy, negotiation when possible, precision when not. Then came the photograph, grainy, blurred, time-stamped from a field in Marib, Yemen. A soldier, kneeling in sand, arms wrapped around a fallen teammate, gun discarded, eyes unfocused, mouth slightly open, as if trying to scream and realizing the world had gone mute. That soldier was Malcolm, and the nation saw him not in uniform, but in loss. More surfaced. Internal records showed he had been nominated for rank advancement 3 times, once to full colonel, twice to the brigadier general. Each time he declined. The final note, hand-signed, was released anonymously. It read, I cannot in good faith accept a command that allows my signature to authorize death while I am still the son of a man sprayed in the street for being too quiet. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't a rebellion. It was the clearest form of strength. A country that used to confusing medals with morality had ever been forced to see. And when people realized that the man who broke the silence had chosen silence again, not out of cowardice, but to prevent himself from becoming what he fought against, They stopped calling him a hero. They started calling him necessary. The final twist wasn't that Malcolm Winston had been powerful, it was that he had refused to wield that power in anger. And the nation, reeling from a decade where every figure of authority had shouted over each other, looked back at a man who had knelt in the sand once, stood in court once, and then vanished. People began asking the right question. What does it mean when the last person who could have led everyone walks away? An op-ed in The Atlantic summed it best. He didn't need rank to issue commands. Because when a man stops needing power to make people listen, the country starts listening to what they ignored. Military academies printed his refusal letter in ethics training modules. One general anonymously commented, "He understood something we forgot, that some uniforms carry ghosts, and if you're not careful, those ghosts become policy." A teenager in Milwaukee got the quote tattooed down his forearm. He didn't need power, he needed peace. And Ellis? He never commented. He never addressed the reveal. When asked in passing if he knew what his son had done overseas, he simply replied, "I taught him how to walk away." Everything else he learned by choosing not to come back. The image of Malcolm's silence became louder than any campaign, any movement, any revolution. Because no man who ever commanded global operations had ended those commands by saying, "No, not under my father's name." And in the wake of that, the country learned something it hadn't realized it needed, that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who doesn't speak, doesn't threaten, doesn't retaliate, because he already knows everyone else will. The silence that followed Malcolm's disappearance did not feel like closure. It felt like withdrawal, like the ground had pulled back its last line of certainty and left the nation to navigate without a compass. And somewhere in the quiet corners of a city that once called him officer, Brad Kinley learned what it meant to become invisible in plain sight. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't assaulted. He simply became something people no longer acknowledged. He was removed from the force, his name scrubbed from personnel rosters. No private firm would hire him for security, not even for grocery store parking lots. The union that once defended him stopped returning calls. The police fraternity that had once raised funds for his legal team had gone radio silent, and he moved back into the spare bedroom of his stepmother's house. A woman who no longer spoke to him without first exhaling, as if preparing herself to face what was left of him. There were no protests at his door, no eggs thrown, no threats, just the same silence he had once weaponized against those he deemed beneath response, now returned to him by the entire country. He tried to reclaim his narrative online, posted a video, but the comments flooded in. Not insults, not arguments, just one word repeated over and over. Painter. That was all. No hashtags, no explanations. The new slur of the silent majority. A reminder that he hadn't just sprayed paint on a man's back, he'd painted himself into a place where redemption was no longer an option. Months passed, and he walked the streets like a ghost in a city that used to salute him. Children didn't point, they looked past. Adults crossed the street without speed or urgency, just instinct. He wasn't feared. He wasn't hated. He had become the one thing worse than remembered. He was unneeded. Every human interaction became a mirror showing him not what people thought of him, but what they refused to assign him, presence. Eventually, he stood on the sidewalk outside the house of Ellis Winston, the same man whose silence had unmade him. His shoes were worn, his eyes sunken, his hands no longer resting on hips like a soldier but stuffed in his pockets, like a boy unsure of where he was allowed to be. The porch light was on. The street is empty. He didn't knock. He just stood. The door opened slowly. No tension, no shock, just inevitability. Ellis stood in the frame, a sweater draped over one shoulder, one hand gripping the edge of the door, the other loose at his side. Still strong, still steady. Brad tried to speak but failed. Ellis said, "You brought something. You want to leave it here, say it." Brad swallowed, his voice cracked. "I came to say, I'm sorry. I came to—" Ellis raised a hand, not in anger, just enough to stop time. "You came to be told what I never gave you, but this isn't about forgiveness. Not anymore." Brad looked down. Ellis continued. What you sprayed on me, that doesn't wash off. It wasn't just paint. It was permission. You gave everyone watching an excuse. To laugh, to ignore, to forget. He paused, then added, but the thing you learned from that, don't let it wash off either. He stepped forward 1 inch, just enough for the porch light to catch Brad's face, thin, pale, soft from months without sun or authority. I don't hate you, Ellis said. You made an entire generation question who we allow to carry weapons in our name. That's not something you answer with prison. That's something you answer with history. The air held. Then Ellis finished, not loud, not kind, just final. You don't need forgiveness. You need to decide what you do with what you finally know. He turned. The door began to close. Brad stood there, unmoving. The door clicked softly, but the porch light remained on, and as it cast his shadow on the sidewalk, not large, not sharp, just real, he realized that no camera would ever capture him again with clarity, because from now on, his name wasn't a title, it was a warning. The porch light stayed on for days after Brad left, not because anyone forgot to turn it off, but because no one dared claim the moment had passed. And while the world adjusted around that silence, another current began to stir, not as uproar, but as realignment. A group of younger veterans, those who had seen war with drones overhead and doubt underfoot, formed a coalition called Honor First. Their mission was simple: restore the names erased not by death, but by institutional neglect. They went through forgotten files, redeployed archive citations, and filed petitions in towns where records had gathered dust thicker than metals. They didn't demand recognition, they demanded correction. And at the center of every slide deck, every mission statement, was the name they never shouted but always built around: Ellis Winston. They spoke his name not as a headline, but as a compass, not to promote it, but to protect what it represented, because the world didn't need another hero. It needed a reference point for what quiet integrity could rebuild when everything else had collapsed from noise. In a small California town, a public library updated its signage. Not a ceremony, not a campaign, just new letters pressed gently against old brick, dedicated to the one who asked for nothing, Ellis Winston. Below that, etched into bronze, some names don't need statues, they need room. No velvet rope, no ribbon to cut, just a silent unveiling on a weekday morning that made even passing students slow down. Photos of the sign traveled without a caption, because it didn't need one, just like the man didn't, and when local media tried to spin it into a larger tribute, the town librarian declined interviews, saying only, "This wasn't a headline, this was a correction." When asked if he would attend the dedication, Ellis sent no reply. When asked if he approved of the use of his name, Malcolm responded instead. Just one message, typed, quiet, final: give power to those who've refused it. That's the only way power ever learns to stop harming. It wasn't a quote designed for billboards. It wasn't tweetable. It was gospel for those who had forgotten what restraint looked like in a world obsessed with control. It began appearing on classroom doors, above locker rooms, inside fire stations, not because it was demanded, but because it echoed what people were too tired to phrase for themselves. And so, November 11th came again, Veterans Day. But this time there were no speeches about Ellis, no plaque unveilings, no documentary clips, just a full minute of silence in the halls of Congress. No names spoken, no flags lowered, just heads bowed, and not a soul dared to fidget, because real honor doesn't beg for attention. It makes noise feel like disrespect. In a small barber shop on North Fulton Street in Baltimore, a single wooden chair remained empty that week. A hand-lettered sign hung from the armrest. This seat is not for comfort. It's for memory. No one sat in it, not even the man who placed the sign there. He'd been cutting hair for 37 years and said less than 37 words when asked about the gesture. Some people asked for a statue. He didn't. So we left a place instead. It became the most photographed chair in the state, not because of fame, but because people need somewhere to place their guilt when apologies are too late. And in the silence that followed, other institutions began to shift. Schools revised history lessons, not out of guilt, but out of recognition that the curriculum had never been neutral. It had just been curated by comfort. Police departments restructured training sequences to begin not with law, but with consequence. Recruits were asked to sit through 8 seconds of archived footage. No narration, no prompts, just Ellis wiping paint off his shoulder, with a child standing behind him. Still, that moment taught more than any handbook ever could, and slowly, one unspoken reality became a common truth, that dignity doesn't expire. It only goes unguarded when systems pretend it was ever optional. No one asked for medals anymore, not in the name of Ellis, not in the name of Malcolm, not in the name of anyone who had ever carried the burden of silence so heavy it taught others how to speak. People began asking harder questions. Who gets remembered? Who gets forgotten? And who had to bleed quietly so the nation could learn how to feel again? And from those questions came fewer parades and more policy. Fewer slogans and more signatures. Legacy faded, not from neglect, but from being rightly replaced by practice. What mattered now wasn't myth, it was alignment. Alignment between name and action, between silence and purpose. And Ellis Winston didn't need to be remembered with applause. He only needed to not be forgotten in the budgets, in hiring freezes, in discharge forms, in seat assignments, in which names got called and which ones always waited. The legacy wasn't in bronze, it was in the bylaw. And as long as those were changed, that was enough. Because true honor isn't about what people chant, it's about the lines they no longer cross. And sometimes a name carved into a door, or a seat left empty, is louder than any anthem sung by those who once failed to listen. Sometimes a minute of silence is heavier than a lifetime of speeches. Sometimes a porch light left on too long becomes the first act of collective remembrance. And sometimes dignity doesn't need to be defended. It just needs to be left undisturbed so the rest of us can finally start acting like we noted. The silence of remembrance slowly gave way to the friction of systems adjusting themselves. Not loudly, not in full apology, but in course corrections that looked, for the first time in decades, like something closer to atonement than protocol. 3 senior officials from the same department that had once rubber-stamped Brad Kinley's advancement quietly vacated their posts. No press releases, no farewell briefings, just a line in a late Friday administrative bulletin. Effective immediately, resignations accepted, but the absence they left behind echoed louder than their tenure ever had. They weren't chased out by protests, they weren't publicly shamed. They left because even their silence had begun to sound like guilt. One internal source reported the final memo that passed between them had no demand, only a sentence underlined in pen. The stain doesn't fade just because you turned away. At the state level, an elite law enforcement academy revised its recruitment guidelines for the first time since the Cold War. Not in headlines, but in curriculum. Not in ceremony, but in code. The new rubric didn't just test marksmanship or physical aptitude. It added something else. One line, quiet, radical, permanent. We measure not just skill, but humility. That word struck harder than any tactical directive, because for the first time, the gatekeeping mechanism had acknowledged that power without introspection was no longer protection, it was a liability. Instructors were instructed to assess how recruits handled being corrected in front of peers, how they responded to silence, and how long they could sit in observation before speaking. A test designed not for aggression, but for control. A new threshold built not to glorify the badge, but to ensure it never outshone the conscience wearing it. Then came the wider ripples. The Department of Defense, after decades of internal debate and buried memos, launched a campaign under a name that required no footnote, no more shadows. The objective was national, immediate, sweeping. It mandated a comprehensive audit of denied honors, buried commendations, and cases like Ellis Winston's, where paperwork failed dignity. It wasn't a reinstatement effort. It was a recognition one, The campaign didn't seek to rewrite medals, it sought to restore truth. Veterans across the country began receiving phone calls, not from bots, not from distant bureaucrats, but from officers, human, real, trained to say one thing first: we missed something, we're here to fix it. And just like that, a nation began the slow, painful act of remembering, not with monuments or speeches, but with red ink reversed and silence finally acknowledged. The campaign wasn't perfect. Some names were still missing. Some wounds are too deep. But for the first time in a long time, the system wasn't reacting to pressure. It was acting from memory. Local VA centers began holding quiet sessions called revisit circles. Open hours where families could bring in documents, photos, or even just names, not to file claims, not to seek compensation, but to speak the names aloud and hear someone else say, "We believe you." One widow of a Korean War medic came out of a center in Minneapolis and told reporters, "I waited 48 years to hear one person say my husband's name without reading it from a file. Today, a stranger said it like it belonged." On a Tuesday evening, a newscast ended with no scandal, no storm, no viral twist, just a single sentence spoken as the credits began. The man who was sprayed never asked for anything. And now the country has given back more than it ever claimed. It didn't feel like closure, it felt like equilibrium, like a balance long overdue. And unlike past reckonings that felt like PR campaigns stretched too thin, this one didn't begin with an apology. It began with reallocation. Budgets shifted. Discretionary spending toward memorial construction was redirected toward case resolution teams. Lawyers were pulled off lobbying contracts and reassigned to clear backlogs. The country, for once, stopped trying to look noble and started trying to be accurate. On digital billboards across highways in 27 states, a new map appeared. Minimalist, grayscale, backlit, and silent contrast. It was the outline of the United States, but slowly, from coast to coast, blotches of faded red began to bloom, one after another like ink on cloth. Each blotch represented a name, a badge, a case, a forgotten veteran, and at the bottom corner a line scrolled gently, "This is not shame. This is remembering." They weren't shaming the country, they were turning it back toward its reflection. 'Cause some stains don't burn, but they mark. And one drop of paint, once sprayed onto the back of a man who had carried more than he'd ever confessed, had now spread into a map of memory. Schools began using the image in sociology and government courses. Professors didn't explain it, they just left it on the screen for 10 minutes and let students sit with their discomfort. One classroom in Portland spent an hour without speaking. A student wrote later in a reflection, "I didn't know justice could be illustrated with silence." Ellis Winston still hadn't spoken to the press, but his image appeared again, not staged, not posed, but caught in profile, sitting outside a clinic, talking softly with a young nurse. No microphone caught the words, but the way his hand rested on hers told a story louder than any broadcast. He wasn't teaching with speeches. He was instructed by endurance. He didn't need recognition. He needed the system to remember what it had almost buried, and it was remembering, one policy at a time, one red stamp reversed, one denial overturned not with celebration, but with solemnity. Because when a system admits it forgot, the correction cannot look like pride. It must look like humility. It must carry the face of the one it almost erased. And Malcolm, he was last seen walking into a private school where he would mentor veterans transitioning to teaching. No announcement, no social media, just one policy request. "I'll serve if no one prints my name on anything." He sat in the back of classrooms, asked more questions than he answered, and told new instructors, "Don't teach what you survived. Teach what others shouldn't have to." One student remembered him walking out into the rain after a lecture without He didn't mind getting wet. she said. He just never learned to rush through anything painful, because justice doesn't always come with a sword or a gavel. Sometimes it walks in wearing no badge, no uniform, no flag. Sometimes it begins with a hand that can't scrub clean the stain it carries, but still reaches out to teach someone else how not to spill again. And that is what Ellis Winston taught this country, that a quiet act can light an entire map, that a refusal to scream can echo further than a chant, that dignity once lost is not recovered by noise but by return, that the real weight of honor is not whether a man receives it, but whether a system can admit why it withheld it for so long. And the most powerful thing about it, no one ever needed to say it out loud again. The most powerful thing about it wasn't that the nation remembered, it was that Ellis Winston never asked it to. And as systems shifted, institutions reeled, and silence was finally acknowledged not as void but as verdict, he remained where he had always been, outside the camera's reach, beyond ceremony, seated not at podiums but in places no one thought to search for legacy. On the final afternoon of that long year, Ellis returned to the bench outside the corner store that had once barred him entry. No film crew followed. No reporter knew. The only witnesses were wind, gravel, and the dozen or so children running in messy circles across the lot across the street, their laughter bouncing like music off cracked sidewalks and forgotten fences. They didn't recognize him, not as a veteran, not as a symbol, just as an old man on a chair with a stillness they hadn't yet learned how to interpret. One boy, no older than 6, stopped his game long enough to stare. He pointed, curious, and ran across the street barefoot, holding out a small adhesive bandage he'd pulled from his pocket. "Mister," he said with complete sincerity, "you got something on your head. You okay?" Ellis looked down at the boy, eyes soft, smile rising slowly like it had to pass through a storm to reach the surface. He took the bandage and said, "Long time ago, son. It's just something people left on me so I wouldn't forget I was still here." The boy blinked, not understanding, but satisfied. He nodded and ran back to the others. The wind shifted slightly, rustling the trees in a soundless salute, as if nature itself had overheard and wanted to pay respect without making it a spectacle. Ellis leaned back in the chair, hand still holding the small bandage like a relic. He didn't need to tape it on. He just needed to know someone had noticed. The back of his shirt carried no flag, no insignia, just a line of thread, hand sewn into the faded cotton by someone he never named. He didn't ask for respect, but he taught us how to give it. Years later, someone would discover that the woman who stitched those words had once been a high school teacher in Georgia. She never met Ellis in person, but after showing a photo of him in her class every year on Veterans Day, she sewed that line on a shirt and mailed it without a return address. She never expected him to wear it. She only wanted him to know someone had heard. A woman passed by and paused. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask for a photo. She only paused long enough to lower her head and continue. Because when a man teaches without speaking, the lesson never feels like a command. It feels like conscience. Later that day, one of the store clerks stepped outside, looked over and returned inside without saying a word, but added a wooden plaque by the bench the next morning that read, "This seat is not for sale. It's been paid in full." No press release followed, no news station came, but within a week, 5 other benches in 5 other towns across the country bore the same line. He sat there for another hour. The sun dipped lower. The shadows stretched. But something in the light felt different. The shadow he cast didn't look like an old man on a bench. It looked like something broader, wider, like a post between 2 truths, like a fence, not to divide, but to remind everyone which side they chose to stand on. A quiet boundary, traced in light, between what had once been done and what must never be done again. One teenager walked by that afternoon, took a photo, and posted it with no caption. It became the most shared image in 3 days, not because it was provocative, but because it made people feel watched. Ellis didn't speak much after that day. He no longer needed to, because every part of his presence now belonged to other people's memories, not in marble, not in museums, but in muscle memory, in silence held during roll call, in the extra second a teacher paused before explaining what honor used to mean, in the quiet pull of a nurse's hands as she signed a discharge sheet, eyes lingering too long on a name she hadn't expected to see returned. In one courtroom in Ohio, a defense attorney quoted Ellis Winston without saying his name, referencing only the man who didn't speak, but made a nation fall silent. The judge paused for a beat, then said, "Noted," and dropped his gavel. Someone once asked Malcolm what he thought his father wanted most. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He didn't want anything, he said. He just wanted the world to stop pretending silence meant surrender. In a country built on volume, Ellis Winston had taught restraint. In a nation obsessed with banners, he had stitched meaning into plain cotton. And in a system addicted to applause, he had chosen a bench instead of a podium, because sometimes the most powerful way to finish something is to refuse to let it be wrapped. In his last few weeks, Ellis received thousands of letters. Most went unread, but he kept them, not to feel admired, but to remember how far the sound had traveled once it stopped being shouted. He wasn't a martyr, he wasn't a headline, he wasn't an icon. He was proof that dignity doesn't scream, that honor doesn't perform, that forgiveness is too cheap a currency when what a nation needs is to grow up. And when asked, in his final recorded interview, if he had anything left to say, he didn't ask for redemption. He only said, "I don't need forgiveness. I need to see people learn something from what happened." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He just sat there, still, as if trusting that someone somewhere would understand without needing to be told twice. There was no funeral aired on national television, no salutes, no choir. His family buried him in the same quiet town where he had once been refused service, a small marker. No date of service listed, just his name, and beneath it, carved deep, he stood, then he sat, and we saw the line between them. On the day he passed, traffic didn't stop. Flags weren't lowered, but outside the same barber shop where his name had been erased from the waiting list years ago, someone left an old, folding chair. No note, no flowers, just the chair, and inside it, a photograph of a man with his back to the camera, looking into light. That photo went viral, but it sat on a shelf in over 30 VA offices within weeks. It became the image used in de-escalation training, not to teach control, but to teach pause. Because in a country always rushing to respond, he reminded people how to hold still and hold steady. An aide once asked a new VA director why that image stayed. The director replied, "Because every time someone tries to forget why we're here, that image reminds them who paid for the silence they work in." And that is how Ellis Winston was remembered. Not as a man who asked for justice, but as a man who made justice look back at itself and ask, "When did I stop being enough?" The answer didn't come with fireworks. It came with restraint. A new generation of leaders began every oath not with flags, but with silence. 1 minute. Every January, no names, just breathe. Because Ellis had never wanted revenge, never demanded status. He didn't want reform wrapped in ribbon. He didn't want his name on buildings. He just didn't want to see the same stain passed to someone else. And for that, he was given something rarer than glory. He was given space, uninterrupted, unused, but not empty. The kind of space where memory builds instead of fades, where people walk by and don't need to ask who was that, because they already know the answer before the question finishes forming. They know because they've carried a silence longer than comfort allowed, because they've sat in rooms where someone didn't speak and everyone still listened, because they've walked past an empty chair and paused. Not because it asked to be seen, but because something in them refused to look away. And that's how it ends, with a man on a bench, a boy with a bandage, a shirt with a thread, a fence made of light, and a nation, for once, learning how to stay quiet and listen.